Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Thinking Christian. I am pleased to welcome today Chrystal L. Downing. She was previously a professor of English and Film Studies and the director or co-director of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College. And that has the most comprehensive collection of Dorothy Sayers' work on the planet. And so she's written a book called The Wages of Cinema, Christian aesthetic of film in conversation with Dorothy L. Sayers. And we're going to be talking about film today and cinema. And so, Chrystal, I'm really excited to have you here. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Glad to be here.
So let's just start out. I think a lot of times when I read through the book, one of the things that I was pleasantly surprised by was that this wasn't about necessarily just story in film. And I think a lot of us get stuck on story. And so your thesis in the book is really to sort of expand beyond story and say, no, there's much more to film that matters. And so maybe that's a good starting point. How would you describe that to your everyday viewer of just a movie? What are they seeing? What should they be paying attention to? And how does story fit in a broader context?
Right. Well, as a professor of film, I'm very aware that most of the famous directors, as well as film theorists, are um, concerned. I was going to say disgusted, but I'll just say concerned about people who reduce film only to story. That film is a medium that emphasizes the visual. And unfortunately, Christians too often reduce film to what I call a content delivery system. And so they're oblivious to the artistry of the form. And that is very ironic for Christians because Christianity is predicated on this radical notion that God took on flesh. God became an incarnated medium through Jesus Christ. And um, that is the means through which salvation occurs through the death and resurrection of Jesus. Um, Sayers was very concerned about this because first of all, she loved film, but she also loved theater. She did a series of radio plays about Jesus where people throughout England, and this was the early 1940s, this is during World War II, Christians set up protests that Sayers did not use King James English in her plays.
Mm, yeah.
And it's as though they didn't want to really understand and get a sense of the the power of the medium itself. They just wanted to protect tradition, King James English.
Yeah.
She described that as being docetism among Christians. Sayers actually got hate mail from Christians. Sayers was accused of causing the fall of Singapore to the Japanese because she refused to censor her plays.
Yeah.
And so docetism comes from the Greek, it means to seem. And in the early centuries of Christianity, there were Christians who said, well, Jesus only seemed to be human. He wasn't really human. And as Bishop Marcion, who reflects docetism, said, well, the trouble with flesh is it's filled with excrement, and there's no way God would be filled with excrement. And so there has been a long tradition in Christianity of rejecting the medium. It's just about the idea. And so Christians approach the film the same way. Just as they reduced Jesus to God's content delivery system, or Docetists did, Christians today are Docetists about film in that it's just about content and you extract a message, and often it a message that really doesn't pay attention to what the director, the filmmakers are doing.
Yeah. Before I ask my next question about that, why don't we frame out who Dorothy Sayers is? I might have started
Okay,
with that. So
that would be
I
helpful.
don't think Dorothy Sayers is going to be familiar to everyone. So give us a little bit about her background, who she is, and why she's so important for Christian aesthetics.
Yes. First of all, a way into understanding Dorothy Sayers is near the end of his life, C.S. Lewis, which most Christians have heard of,
Yeah.
and probably seen the Narnia films. Lewis was asked, who are some influences on your spiritual life?
Mm,
Everybody knew about his journey to faith and how Tolkien was part of that. But this
yes.
was later in life. And he named four people, two specialists on mysticism, G.K. Chesterton and Dorothy L. Sayers. So these plays that I just told you about, these radio plays about Jesus, where Christians got upset about them, C.S. Lewis, when he got, actually Sayers sent him a copy of her published edition of his plays, he so valued them that he read them every year for 20 years, every year until he died. So Dorothy Sayers was a spiritual mentor to C.S. Lewis. He was reading her radio plays about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus um, while he's writing the Narnia Chronicles. So she is very significant in his life, but also because of these radio plays, a lot of people listened to the BBC programming because all these Christians were protesting it.
Yeah.
And it was actually discussed in Parliament um, as what is this one? Very tradition bound. So thousands of people listened to the plays because they assumed Dorothy Sayers was just demythologizing and, why are all these Christians upset? And no, she was telling the gospel story. She got thousands of letters from people saying, for the first time in my life, I understand
Mm,
what the Christian message is about. And she told C.S. Lewis this. I've gotten thousands of letters.
yeah.
So God works in mysterious ways, right? Well, that was later in her life. She was born in 1893, so 5 years before C.S. Lewis. She grew up, her father was a rector, so she grew up in a Christian background, but Christianity in England at that time was just so connected with politics. Bishops
Mm,
in the Anglican Church are part of Parliament. You know, um, she considered herself a Christian, but it's just didn't mean that much to her. She
I
got
see.
this very prestigious scholarship to go to Oxford University, and she was so glad she was at a college. It was the women's college, Somerville College, that it didn't have chapel, and she didn't have to go to chapel. So she would write home to her mother. Um, not asking questions about Christianity or faith. She'd write home to her mother saying, can you send me some cigarettes? And we're talking in 1912. Um, so she then went to, after she graduated, and at Oxford, people don't realize that at Oxford University, in when Sayers was there between 1912 and 1915, Oxford already had six cinemas. So Sayers was going to
Yeah.
movies and she would write home
Interesting.
about them.
Yeah.
She was just fascinated about them. She actually won a prize in photography when she was in what we would call high school level. So she knew the power of the visual. And when she was working in France, she was working at a school there, she met a film director and they just had this conversation and he invited her to write scenarios for film. And she said, and she loved it. She would have liked to have become a screenwriter,
Mm,
but that when she met the director, it was during the demise of the film enterprise in France went downhill after World War I.
okay.
So she just needed money. And that's when she started writing detective fiction. And she invented this character named Lord Peter Wimsey. And her detective fiction became bestsellers in the period between the wars. Dorothy Sayers was far more famous than Agatha Christie.
Huh.
And her detective fiction has a more intellectual component. But her primary detective is not religious.
Yeah.
Um, and because she wasn't interested in being in religion. But then, because she was this best-selling author, she was invited to write a play for Canterbury Cathedral. And that play forced her, because the plays about Canterbury
Hmm.
for the festival at Canterbury had to be about the cathedral, the history of the cathedral. And of course, what
Okay.
is the cathedral built about and for? Jesus
Right.
Christ. So she had to take her worldview. She had developed this intense interest in the integrity of work, but she had to figure out, well, what does that have to do with Christianity? And at that point, she developed a theory that the Imago Dei, which comes from Genesis 1:27,
Yep.
where we're told that we're created in the image of God. And she realized, well, we're created in the image of God. In Genesis 1, what is the God of Genesis 1? That God is not a lawgiver, not a judge, not a redeemer. The God of Genesis 1, in whose image we are created, is a
Mhm.
creator.
Yeah.
And so the imago Dei, or the image of God, then must be creativity. But then she said, yeah, but the Christian view of God is Trinitarian. And so in this play, she actually has one of the angels at the end of the play explaining how creativity reflects Father, Son, Holy Ghost.
Mm.
And she aligned the idea, or aligned her concept with the Father corresponds in the artist's life to an idea, and then the Son corresponds to energy, and then the Holy Spirit corresponds to power. Now, that seems very abstract, but
Yeah.
if you look at creative people, they often say, yeah, I have this idea, and I just started fleshing it out.
Yep.
And the incarnation of an idea, they aren't separate. The idea and the incarnation of it are one, just as Father and Son are one. And then the power arises from that collaboration between Father and Son, or idea and energy. And you get power, and then the power affects other people. But first, it affects the artist. The three are one. Any
Yeah.
artist, whether it is a painter or a writer or a filmmaker, the idea has to be incarnated first, become a
Yeah.
medium
Yeah.
before, and but the first power is to oneself. Like any writer or filmmaker, they'll writer will look at the rough drafts, filmmaker look at early reels, and they say, oh, we got to change that. So the,
Yeah.
the power, so the three are one. This blew people away. Nobody had ever talked this way before. And
Yeah.
a someone who read this play that was transformative in Sayers' life says, you've got to write a book about this. And the book was called The Mind of the Maker.
Mhm.
Still to this day, there are people who are interested in the relationship between Christianity and the arts, and they're discovering Dorothy Sayers. In her own day, the famous cultural critic Jacques Barzun celebrated what he called Sayers' Christian aesthetic.
Yeah.
And um, then Philip Yancey, which a lot of Christians have heard, who many Christians have heard of. He wrote a Christianity Today article about the brilliance of Sayers' Trinitarian aesthetic. And he says, yes, I experience that every time I write. And
Yeah.
then in 2020, the famous Christian artist Makoto Fujimura published a book with Yale University Press where he starts with Dorothy Sayers, The
Yeah.
Mind of the Maker.
Yeah.
And C.S. Lewis himself called Mind of the Maker indispensable. So here is a Christian aesthetic.
Yeah.
And anybody who has studied Sayers is very familiar with it, but nobody had applied it to film. And
Yeah.
since I taught film, I thought I could do that. And then here's another little tidbit. Because my husband and I were directors of the Wade Center, I had access to all of Dorothy Sayers' unpublished work. And significantly enough, the woman who put together the 4-volume collection of Sayers' letters left out every single letter in which Sayers praises film.
Really
So this is
interesting.
why nobody has been
Yeah.
aware of
Yeah.
this before. So
Fascinating.
I was able to retrieve all this unpublished material where Sayers not only tells her parents about this, and most of the films she singles out, film theorists would agree with her that
Yeah.
this is a superb film. So she was seeing film right when film theory, so she was theorizing right when film theory, the early days of film theory. So the
Yeah.
connections are amazing.
Well, I will say, so as I was reading through and sort of getting your treatment of Sayers, but also the way you arrange your book, you talk about the emergence of the history of film. And I found that so helpful because there are a couple angles here. I mean, number one, it's emerging from theater, which is a very different medium. And when you watch a film, if you go to watch a musical on stage or anything on stage, and then you watch a film, you're going, yeah, these are different, completely different. But I would also say, nowadays, I kind of grew up in online education. So I was a dean of an online college
Hmm.
prior to doing what I'm doing now. And one of the things we sort of struggled with was, do you post recorded lectures in the classroom online? Is this
Wow.
really a good practice? Because what you're doing is you're saying, well, it's one context. There's a whole different feel to a lecture in a classroom where you're actually sitting there listening to someone who's standing there. Then there is recording that and putting it online. It's not exactly the same feel. And so it'd
Mhm.
be similar to what my family and I watched. Oh, it was one of those big musicals. I can't remember what the name of it was now, but they started streaming it live online. And I was like, this is cool. Like we get to see it and whatever. But having been to see musicals on stage at Broadway and those kind of things, like it wasn't the same. It was
Right.
actually kind of almost boring to watch because you're actually getting the camera angles on the singers. You're not necessarily getting the whole state. Like you don't get to see it and feel it the same way. And so
Mhm.
it was almost like, yeah, it was cool to get to see it and you get to hear it and all that kind of good stuff. But the medium really does impact its power, right? And what it can actually convey. It doesn't do it as well as online. And so I just thought I thought the emergence of film from theater was really interesting. The shift from into silent movies where they're using, fade ins and fade outs, right,
Mhm.
to the different cuts and scenes that
Mhm.
film has, and all of that contributing to the form. And so I think that was one of the things in your book that I most appreciated was that film had to emerge and it had to sort of take on its own life. And I think theorists like Sayers were recognizing that it needed to take on its own life, and obviously some talented directors figuring some of this stuff out. But it's sort of amazing to see how it emerged out of that and took its
Mhm.
own form on.
Mhm. Right. Yes, I was very committed to, as you say, showing the history of film because many paradigms came out of theater for understandable reasons.
Right.
Early filmmakers were usually involved with theater until
Yeah.
this new form developed and they made the transition. But the incarnation of the stage, which is what you're talking about,
Yeah.
is really powerful. Having the actual physical bodies there. And the wonderful thing about theater is that you, as the audience, have power over what happens on stage, insofar as any actor who has been on stage will tell you the audience affects performance. If they can feel the audience laughing in the right places, and they can just feel if the audience is connected.
Right.
And um, and if there's someone disruptive in the audience, that can affect the actors on stage. So when film came out of theater, many people were conceptualizing it as just another presentation of theater and it was really the Russians who took leadership.
Mm.
A lot of people don't realize the very first film school was in Moscow. Russians
Yeah.
saw the power of the medium much sooner than, especially the development in America. It was all about capitalism. How much money can you make off this?
Sure.
And it was Europeans who saw it as an art form. So rather than the actors being the medium in film, um, it is the film itself. The
Yeah.
film is the medium. And so attention to how the film is cut and put together, still borrowing a lot of terms from theater.
Yep.
So much of what we understand about storytelling by human figures goes back to the ancient origins of theater. And again, many people don't realize that theater originated as a religious rite.
Sure.
So there's this connection between religious sensibilities and theater, and then the
Hmm.
appropriations into film that Christians need to be more aware of.
Yeah, it's not a big leap to go from the ritualistic expressions in the temple, how you have these the laying on of hands of the scapegoat and sending one off into the
Uh,
wilderness, the different sacrificial things where you're actually embodying and incarnating something live before people as
mhm.
opposed to explaining it, right?
Yeah.
Just having someone
Yes.
stand up and go, now, if we had a sheep here, here's what we would do, and this is what it would mean. That's a whole different thing. But when you actually do it, that gives a different picture. And so it's a small leap, I think, from those sort of ritual enactments to something that you're trying to convey live in a theater setting in like ancient Greece or ancient Rome, where you're
Mhm.
trying to convey sort of an aspect of the ritualism that was going on wherever, but just in a slightly different mode. And so I think that embodiment, it seems to me that there's an organic connection between that sort of embodiment.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right, right. So for many years, film had a stigma that
Hmm.
didn't have the embodiment of theater, and many
Yeah.
theater actors, they would not deign to act in a movie.
Yeah.
But it's because they were still bringing theatrical sensibilities to their understanding of film, and you have to see it as a different
As
medium.
its whole medium. I
Right.
I heard Denzel Washington, I think it was Denzel Washington, if I'm remembering correctly. He said that the theater is really the actor's medium, but the film is the director's medium.
Yeah. Right.
And so it's not that there's no acting that goes on in a film, but at the end of the day, like he said, the director spends, months after the actors are gone arranging and cutting and sequencing and like really making that film his own or her own versus the theater where it's just happening live and the actors are on
Hmm.
stage and they're like you're describing, they're reacting to the audience. And so I think it's helpful to underscore that difference.
Hmm.
um, I will say, you mentioned Russia, where I started to become more familiar with this was a few years back. I went to on a trip to Germany and we were doing like the World War II um, sort of tour, and you saw those movies that were done as propaganda films of Hitler and the Nazis, and they talk about how they were shooting Hitler mostly from the ground
Ah,
up, and how they, how
yes.
they created these scenes that would, I hesitate to say reinforce the message, but maybe become part of the overall power of the film. And so they're trying to portray Hitler and his various cohorts as uh, larger than life almost. And
Hmm.
you can really only do that in film.
Yes, that's
You could,
right.
or maybe you could do it in film differently than you could do it in real life because they pulled an awful lot off in real life too. But
Yeah.
in film, they could really, I mean, they play with the lighting, they play with the sound, they play with the music, they play with the shots, the clipping, all that kind of stuff to really make these
Hmm.
films like part of the message that came through was the visual effect of the film. I don't know whether I'm saying
Hmm.
that right, but
Yeah. No, exactly. In fact, D.W. Griffith, the famous filmmaker, is the first one to actually figure out the psychology of what you do to the medium. So he was the
mm,
first filmmaker, and he was making films during Sayers' life. He was the first person to put the camera on the ground so you could look up at, up a person's body and you might see the ceiling above them. And I'm sure that's what they did with Hitler because it makes
yeah,
them look more powerful because they fill the whole screen. They look like their
yeah,
head is almost touching the ceiling. And
yeah,
he added the psychological effect of cross-cutting, where you go from um, different scenarios, like a woman is being threatened by bandits, and the husband is on his way home, and meanwhile, the cavalry is coming and cutting back and forth. And what Griffith would do, you cut among the three different shots, but then make them each fewer minutes. So
yeah,
it's like boom, 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 boom,
right.
boom, 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 boom. And it actually has the viewer, it's like your heart races while you're watching this. So this was
Yeah.
developed early, early on. In fact, there are many theorists who say the height of artistry in film was during the silent film era
Mm,
because you had to
yeah.
rely on the
The
visual.
visual. Yeah.
And once sound came in, a lot of people, it was just mimicking theater again, and they lost the power of the medium. Of course, now that's been resolved again, and the
Yeah.
great filmmakers understand the medium itself
Yeah.
and pay attention to it. Um, there is a wonderful film that deals with this. In fact, I spend quite a long time talking about it because it is addressing the very issue of the tension between theater and film. It's called Birdman. It stars Michael
Yeah.
Keaton. It is a fantastic film because um, it's helping us think through why there is still tension to this day between theater and film.
I would say that was along with the and I don't remember the title of the movie exactly, but the bridge movie that you
Uh,
note in the book.
Oh yeah, The
Um,
Railway Man or David
the
Lean's Bridge on the River Kwai.
Bridge on the River Kwai. That's it.
Okay.
Bridge on the River Kwai. The Birdman and Bridge to the River Kwai really, I thought, drove home a lot of what you were talking about in the book. I mean, the Birdman stuff, even when you were talking about sound, what came to my mind was that section of the book where you describe the two different types of sound,
Oh
sound
yeah.
that's within the movie and sound that comes without the movie, and the way they
Yes.
played with our expectations in that film where you'd hear music start and you're thinking, oh, okay, that's outside the film. This is part of the score. And then he'd walk down a hallway and see somebody playing the music. And so it just like disrupted your expectations. And it was just that section was such a great example of the way that film can actually work and sort of play with us a little bit. I thought it was fascinating.
Oh,
Yeah.
good, good. Well, and that's a good example of a term that goes way back to the Greeks and Greek theater. What you're describing is called diegetic and non-diegetic sound,
That's
which
right.
theorists talk about sound that's part of the diegesis, and that's a Greek word for the story, the world of the story. So there, you have to know about theater to understand a lot of borrowings that film theorists have made to understand the distinctiveness of their medium
Yeah.
from the Greek. or from, yeah, the Greeks started theater, that
Right.
that whole history of theater.
Let me ask a question because I mean, I think having read your book I've done a little work with like Marshall McLuhan and media ecology and
Ah,
some of those kind of aspects. So not everything in the book was unfamiliar to me, although I haven't done a lot with film studies. Right. So there was that. But as I was reading it, I sort of got in my mind if Christians who are watching films don't understand this, there's an interesting way I was thinking like we're if we get too consumed with the story, I think that can be good and bad. You know, we've seen sort of the bad applications of that in the movie where it's like you just have this very on the nose presentation and it doesn't really fit the movie that well. And you know, you're in this odd, I mean, I mentioned before we started filming, there was that scene in Fireproof where they're out in the woods and there's a cross and, you know, all of a sudden they're sharing the four spiritual laws. And I'm like, this doesn't even feel natural,
yeah.
right? Like, I get it. It's the right message, but man, it feels a little out of place in the movie. And so
Mhm.
there's this disjointed kind of thing that we can get in with the message. But it also struck me that you could get to a point where the message seems so wholesome that you neglect the visual aspects and what the film is actually doing to you and what it's really reinforcing. And I think when I
Mhm.
was reading that portion on the bridge of Kauai, um, and seeing the reactions of people who are really in the POW camp, the sort of strong man that was, you know, he'd escaped and, you know, it was no problem for him to escape. And he's like this pillar of masculinity and Americanism and all that kind of stuff. And you're like, if we're not noticing those things, I think some of that's going to get embedded in our brains as if that's appropriate. That's the message that we need to hear. And so, how do you balance that? How do you think your understanding of the form of the film would actually help Christians understand the whole of the medium better and sort of grasp and be able to critique and say, this is true, good, and beautiful, but it's also incomplete?
Mhm. Mhm. Second-rate films tend to create either or categories. Here are the good guys, here are the bad guys. And it manipulates you to identify with the good guy by giving point of view shots or POV shots or
Mm-hmm.
OTS shots, over the shoulder shots, so that you're seeing from the protagonist's viewpoint, and then the antagonist is the shots often might be done in chiaroscuro, so low-key lighting. Um, I think really superbly done films, the medium itself can compromise, not compromise isn't a good word because that has negative connotations. It can make more complex either
Mm.
or thought. And what's interesting about David Lean's Bridge on the River Kwai, which is one of the great films of all time, 1957, um, is it's set up at the beginning, and this is based on a real incident
Yep.
where soldiers were, American soldiers were captured after the fall of Singapore, which, by the way, I forget if I mentioned this earlier, but Dorothy Sayers was accused of causing the fall of Singapore to the Japanese because she refused to censor her radio plays about Jesus that didn't use King James English. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
Christians were just out of control. But again, God used that. A lot of
yeah.
people came to Christ because of the controversy. Anyway, um, so the medium where you're expecting, oh, the Americans or the British actually in this film, good guys, Japanese bad guys. But then when you see various shots and how the Japanese guard of the prison looks at, um, we get his POV, and then the British commander who's been imprisoned. and it just aligns the
Yeah.
medium itself without any spoken language. The
Yeah.
medium shows, hey, they share sensibilities.
Yeah.
So paying attention to camera angles, to montage, which is a common word in film theory, borrowed from the French, which is a collection of shots.
Yeah.
It can communicate things totally apart from language.
Yeah.
And that's, unfortunately, this is why many people despair over the development of talkies. And Sayers,
Yeah.
too, she despaired over talkies because in the early years of talkies, it destroyed, for many people, the power of film.
It's such an interesting idea that talking could actually obscure the visual. And I'm sure as it's evolved, and I mean, I guess I've seen films that I would say, yeah, they shouldn't have talked here, right? You got to leave that alone. But aligning the speech with the visual seems to me to be a far more powerful way to communicate. Not that you couldn't communicate one or the other, like on radio, you just have talking. In silent films, you obviously just have visual. So I mean, it can happen both ways, but when it's done well, I think it aligns pretty well.
Yeah, yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about one. I thought it'd be interesting to get your take on one of the films I usually go back to, right when I think about a really good film. But I was pretty young when I watched it. But Memento. Have you ever seen Memento by Christopher Nolan?
Yes, but it's been so long, I probably can't comment on
No,
it.
it's
Yeah,
okay.
if I haven't written about a film, I often don't remember it.
I
So what,
I'll just
tell
say,
us what you thought about it.
well, yeah, I think when I was reading that section of the book where you're talking about this complexity, the visual complexity, the way that you can shift away from that sort of sharp either or in a film. That movie, I think, was one of the early ones that really helped me understand that.
Ah,
And so
good.
you
I'll have
have
to go
this,
back and see it again.
yeah, it's this fascinating story. It's about a guy whose wife is murdered. He was injured in this home robbery, and he doesn't have the ability to develop new memories. And so the way he puts the movie together, you're sort of watching aspects of it in reverse. And so a character in one scene can appear sympathetic and helpless and really, sincere in seeking this guy's help. And then in the next scene, I remember one with like she's a waitress and she spits in his food, like she's kind of going to manipulate him. But you
Yeah.
don't see that until the second scene. And at the end, he gets this information that he's already found the person who killed his wife, and this other guy's sort of been manipulating him to take out other people. And he makes a conscious decision in that moment to lead him back to killing that guy.
Uh,
And so you see this poor guy who had no agency the whole movie now making a choice to give himself agency to get him out of this situation, but he'll never know that he did it. It was just
hmm
sort of this fascinating sort of mix up
hmm
of sympathetic character, good character, bad character, like, but it's all mixed up into one group of people. There wasn't a clear hero in the whole
hmm
bunch, you know,
Yeah, yeah.
really fascinating.
One of the things that Dorothy Sayers said in that applies to this is
Yeah.
we are all both Cain and Abel.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
We all, for all have sinned and fallen short of the
Yeah.
glory of God. And
Yeah.
that's why these films that make these simplistic categories of good guy versus bad guy, um, even what you're describing shows that something film can do that theater would have trouble doing
Yeah.
is use images to embody memories and um, thoughts, whereas on
Yeah.
stage, the person just has to say, "Oh, I remember the time that
Right. Right.
that this woman spit in my food," you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's just not going to be as powerful as when you have a sense that, okay, this is what's happening in his brain.
Right.
And it's no coincidence that some production companies are called DreamWorks because our brains come up with images, and at least the way I dream, there's not much conversation
Right.
in the dream, but
Yeah.
yet I know what is happening.
Yeah. I've been doing a lot of study in Revelation. And so I think as I was also reading through your book and thinking through the images, obviously Revelation is a text-based medium. But when we look at it from a hermeneutics perspective, we usually what we try to do when we're interpreting that is we try to visualize what's being presented in text. So there's a symbolic aspect to that book that you really need to try to visualize to some extent
Mm-hmm.
in order to understand that this symbolic aspect, this representational aspect, is part of the message of the book. Now,
Yes.
again, do you want to make a movie of Revelation? Probably not.
Uh-huh.
Like, but there is an imaginative aspect of that book that isn't really available in like one of Paul's letters, let's say. You don't really need to understand what one of Paul's cohorts, like, you don't really need to know what Philippian look like, right? Right. Or not Philippian, Philemon, what Philemon looked like to understand what's going on in Philemon.
Mm-hmm.
But in Revelation, because the text uses symbols
Mm.
and paints
Yeah.
pictures, you almost have to get involved in that sort of medium. And like I said, it's obviously just text based, but I remembered a portion, I think I understood this correctly, that even when Sayers would write her detective novels, she really did focus on trying to, quote, paint a picture with
Yes.
words within her novels because she'd understood the power of this sort of visual activating, we might say, activating the visual system.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
Yes. Yes. Because she loved camera work. And she actually wrote home once and was talking about um visual pictures. And I forget now because she was very young, um, while in college, whether it was a photograph or a film that she saw. But she said, "It needs no words!" Exclamation point, exclamation point. Just
Yeah.
the power of the visual image.
Yeah.
Um, what you're talking about too is relevant to actual discipline within film studies, which is called adaptation studies.
Okay.
The whole adapting a novel or adapting a play
Oh,
to
sure.
film. And people will complain, oh, it's not like the novel. Well, of course, it's not like the novel. They
Right.
are different mediums. And
Right.
in fact, the closer film tries to be to the novel, it's going to be a crummy film.
Yeah.
And so, how can the visual image speak what maybe took 10 pages
Right.
to cover in a novel? And you can do it in just this maybe 1 minute
Yeah.
shot.
Yeah.
And so I think many people, because they aren't attuned to the power of the visual image, they aren't aware that maybe the film is doing more than you are seeing.
Yeah.
That is interesting too, going back to Genesis 1 and the
Hmm.
Imago Dei, that every time God creates something, it says, and he saw that it was good.
That's right.
And the word, I've been told in Hebrew, just literally means seeing.
Hmm.
So God's seeing of creation. And so then we're made in the image of God. How do we see human creations and value the beauty and the poignancy of
Yeah.
those creations?
Yeah. There's almost when we talk about that seeing in Genesis, I would say that in addition to just looking at it, what you almost have there is a discernment about the value of. So you're seeing it, but it's not just a visual activity.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
also a capturing and an understanding of what this is in terms of tov. It's good,
yes.
and so I wouldn't boil it down to just the biological, physiological act of seeing something. But I also wouldn't say that it goes so far beyond seeing like we should translate it judgment or something like that. I don't think that's what
Mhm.
it is. It's an understanding and a capturing of the value of the thing that's
Mhm.
been created. And
Yes.
so, yeah, I really like that.
Yeah.
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 Very cool.
Well, yeah. One thing I want to add, because I don't want people to think, and I make this clear in the book, that Sayers is saying the Imago Dei can only be fulfilled by
Right.
artists, that um, creativity can enter any profession. And
Yeah.
she actually, to make this point, she says, whether it's church embroidery or sewage farming, someone can practice the integrity of work and be creative
Yeah.
about it, like a sewage farmer, rather thinking, hey, I have all this sewage here. How might it be used for fertilizer for farmers in the next county? You
Right.
know, that's an act of creativity rather than just kind of going through your job. Or a parent, you know, how can I be creative about entertaining my child in ways that gets them to be more critical thinkers rather than just handing them a screen?
Yeah. Well, when you talk about the integrity of the work, right, and
Mm.
that sort of idea, just the picture that comes to mind, and it's one that you reference in the book, Dodgeball, the
Oh,
movie Dodgeball, because you
uh-huh.
have this whole discussion about the Deus Ex Machina, right?
Yeah,
And how sometimes movies will just use this, and it's like, oh, this helicopter comes out of nowhere and
yeah,
rescues the person, and now the show's over, and you're like, where did the
yeah.
helicopter come from? Like, what is happening? Like, it doesn't feel like it closes anything up, really. It just needs to end. Like, we're out of time, so let's send a helicopter in. Boom, done.
Hmm.
But what I found fascinating about Dodgeball is if you think about it, the treasure chest that they pull out at the end. If people have seen the movie, he bets on a dodgeball match and wins a bunch of money to save his gym. It's like a goofball movie,
Yeah,
but the treasure chest has Deus Ex Machina on it, and so
yes,
it's this sort
yes.
of ironic, self-referential, like the movie knows what it's doing. Right. And by putting that on there, it's saying, we know what we're doing. Like we needed to button this up. And then you have the post-credit scene of Ben Stiller in a fat suit kind of complaining about, oh, the good guy won and you got your happy ending and the horrible whatever. And so it had this sort of those scenes and those little nuggets allowed for the film to maintain an integrity within itself. Whereas
Yes.
without those elements, you're kind of like, eh, really again?
Yeah, yeah,
Like,
yeah, that's right. You have to pay attention to those tiny little things. And that Deus Ex Machina is one of the elements that film theorists have borrowed from Greek and Roman theater. Horace coined that word to describe how the Greeks, in order to resolve a narrative, they actually devised a crane and would lower a god like Zeus, or an actor portraying a god,
right.
Zeus, onto the stage, and comes and he says, you go here, you two lovers get together, case closed.
Yeah.
And it's just,
And
it's
done.
outrageous, but a lot of films today just, what, like you're describing, do the same thing.
Yeah.
And when I was teaching at UCLA, my students often would be recruited to watch Hollywood films and give feedback on the endings, and they would
Mm.
change the ending depending on audience response. Kind of like,
Yeah.
okay, we want to make money from this movie. That's not going to be a good movie where it's just
Right.
how how much money can we make? We better get some feedback. And so they will do Deus Ex Machina, as film theorists talk about it, but applying it
Yeah.
to, um, yeah, the artificially happy endings. And wow, there's so many films that I was thinking, this is an interesting film, and then they just give me artifice at the end.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you can see that all over the place. And I think it's interesting, even movies that I kind of enjoy. The end of the Matrix series where you have the robot coming in and taking Neo away. And
Hmm.
I think you reference this in the book as well. They have the robot credited as Deus Ex Machina.
Yeah.
They don't say it in the movie. And so unless you're
Right.
really paying attention, like that cleared up
Yes.
a lot of things for me when I read in your book. And I'm like, but I thought it was a horrible ending.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
kind of hated it. I'm like, this is where we're leaving this? This is
Yeah.
horrible.
Yeah.
Um, and so you have these sort of disappointing moments where you're like, yeah, that didn't feel like it fit well enough to actually make the movie, like to actually close things off. Just didn't feel like it fit well. Whereas you think about movies like, I don't know, one of my favorites is Rocky. Rocky should
Oh.
lose in the end, right? He should lose. This is
Mhm.
this is what should happen, and it
Mhm.
does. And you're like, that was the kind of the perfect ending to that movie, I thought. I my daughter read 1984 this last year for high school,
Mm.
and the ending of that book, I told her, I'm like, this is like the perfect ending. This is what the
Mm.
book needed for integrity. Like the guy can't win, can't beat the
Yeah.
machine. That's the whole point. And so, I
Yes.
think there are some works with that integrity. Um, but I'm glad we got to that integrity of work kind of conversation. Hopefully, people kind of get that it's internal to the work itself. It needs to be true almost to itself, while also trying to be true to the reality that it's representing. I think is a fair
Mhm.
way to put that.
Yes. Yes. Right.
Okay.
Again, rather than either or, it's both and.
Right.
So it's not just about the visual image. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, you got to consider story as well.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, most Christians, when they talk about film, they just only think of story.
Yeah.
And uh, people from Alfred Hitchcock to the famous film theorist Christian Metz, they just say it's not just about story.
Yeah.
It's story and art. It's both and. And Christians need to be both and thinkers because we follow a both and Savior. He's both
Yeah.
fully God and fully human. And we hear it so often that we forget the radicalness of God's incarnation in
Yeah.
Christ.
Yeah.
So we've got to honor in our faith, it's about the medium of flesh
Yeah.
that God took. So in our understanding of art, we have to pay attention to the medium that has been enfleshed on screen, on paper,
Yeah.
whatever.
Well, we're coming up on the end of the time, and I just want to ask this last question because I think it's important. Like, how would you suggest then Christians approach film? Obviously, we've had some sort of moral, pietistic approaches to film,
Mhm.
right? And
From
I think,
both the right and the left.
yeah, and I think those can be appropriate, right? So, I would try to steer my kids, for instance, away from movies that have, gratuitous nudity or something like
Oh,
that.
of course.
But then
Well,
you
and I
you
have a whole chapter on women and
on
film
women
too
in
before
film,
that.
right? Well, but what I find fascinating is now I'd want them to be at a maturity age where they could really appreciate the film. But like Schindler's List
Mm.
portrays nudity in the film, but it's a very realistic, sort
Hmm.
of portrayal of what's happening in, concentration camps. And so you kind
Yes.
of sit back and you're like, well, this is a different sort of nudity than we're used to seeing.
Hmm.
And so I think yes, there's a morality that we need to consider as we're approaching film, but then we also have to appreciate the fact that in order to drive some of this stuff home, uh, the reality has to be captured. And so I'm just wondering, I've kind of thought about that one in different ways throughout the years, and I'm still not really sure where I land on it, but help us understand how to maybe give us some frameworks for approaching film and how Christians might think about film differently.
Well, part of it is to pay attention to what I call the stigmata of
Mm,
film. Um, St. Francis, of course, was the first incident of bearing the stigmata, which are the signs of Christ, and in his palms having the cuts. And to think of rather than film as stigma, the stigmata is paying attention to the cuts in film. When does
mm,
film cut from one image to another, and why? Um, and that is the attention to the medium and its
yeah,
relationship to the story. But to be aware too of camera movement
Okay.
why is the camera um, doing a panning shot from one way to the other? And just to ask her to be more mentally active. And mental activity is good, it prevents dementia. So many people, I mean, they are couch potatoes, so they'll just watch a
Yeah.
film. It's just to pass the time away. But
Right.
if you start just even thinking of it as an art form, and so before I see a film, I always read reviews beforehand
Mm,
to see what people I respect are saying about it. Um, and these days, I talk about the problem with there's fundamentalism on both the right and the left. And now
sure.
films that are getting all this praise, it's just because they have a certain ideological
Hmm.
component that is, it's fundamentalist wokeism.
Yeah.
And so how do we achieve what Dorothy Sayers called that delicate edge of balance?
Yeah.
And actually, she called it the razor edge of balance, the delicate balance, razor edge of balance. So to be a more active viewer, which again is uh, has Christian implications, is that church just shouldn't be this passive thing where we go to because we know, oh, this is important to go to church.
Right.
We are active participants. Sayers actually said, and the reason I use the word stigmata is she says, I believe the theater has all the stigmata of a real and active church
Mm,
because and then I would say the same thing about film
film.
because it's
Yeah.
inherited much from theater. Every person working for a production, either of a play or a film, is really important. It's not just about the preacher, or it's not just about the good in church, the
Yeah.
good, whether you like the music or not.
Yeah.
Um, every member of a church contributes. And too often people reduce the they don't think about the importance of the lighting technician on for both stage and screen. They don't
Right.
think about the sound technician for both stage and screen. If they aren't doing their job, you're going to have a horrible
Right.
experience as an audience member. So it's just much more active viewing. And one of the things I
Okay.
do, and there are all these books written by Christians where they don't talk about the history of film, they don't talk about camera movement, they don't use the language of film, they have no awareness of film theory. That is like a Christian who has no awareness of the history of Christianity and that the Trinity wasn't even, the word Trinity wasn't even coined until 200 by Tertullian. And
Yeah.
interestingly enough, Tertullian used a word from theater to conceptualize the Trinity. I mean,
Yeah.
there are scholars who think that Jesus was involved before his ministry, helping his dad build a theater that has been found 4 miles from Nazareth you
Yeah.
know, and Jesus uses the language of theater. The word for actor was hypocritai.
Yeah.
And so someone putting on an act, he got that from theater. I mean, there are so many interconnections between Christian faith and the valuing of the arts.
Yeah. Well, and we see this in some theological works. I think von Balthasar's Theodrama,
Oh, yes.
his
Yes,
multi-volume series
Theodrama.
on
And I quote
Theodrama,
from him.
and then
He's amazing.
yeah, and then Van Hooser's Drama of Doctrine, I think, sort of revised some of those
Mhm.
things. But it is really important. And I love the advice to be active watchers, like turn your brain on when you're watching a movie. Maybe not all the time,
Yeah,
if you're,
yeah.
but it's okay to leave it off sometimes. But I also think that if we're really going to seriously be impacted by a film, if we're not just going to kind of sit there and it's just downtime. We're really not watching that closely. But if we're really going to be impacted by a film, we do need to be thinking actively about what's going on and what the film is trying to convey to us. I wouldn't
Yes.
say do to us. I appreciated one
Yes.
aspect. I think you mentioned it. It's the film itself has power. It doesn't try to exert power over the watcher.
Right. Right.
And so I think, when we're watching good art, it has a power all of its own that we're going to be impacted by, but it's not trying to. And I think this goes to the comment about the ideological sort of bent nowadays. That's trying to exert a power over us in a way,
Exactly.
as opposed to containing that power within itself and allowing us just to be impacted by that
Hmm.
presence of it within the work.
Hmm.
So
Yeah. And her Trinitarian perspective, we are actually participating in the creation of the art by thinking about it.
yeah,
She has a whole chapter in Mind of the Maker called Pentecost. The Holy Spirit came down on the disciples,
yeah,
and this was a movement towards participating in Christ's message.
yeah,
So, but that means not passivity. So it has, as I say and you say, have
yeah,
power over us. We
yeah,
bring our power of observation
to it.
to the
Yeah,
film.
yeah. It's just part of the act of watching, really.
Hmm.
It becomes part of that
And here,
overall ecosystem.
oh, there's so much
Yeah,
more to say. What's really cool is Sayers says any artists will recognize there is a triadic component to any artwork. And I show the verification of that insight with Ingmar Bergman, who said, yes, I have a
mm,
triadic approach, famous Swedish filmmaker
yeah,
Francois Truffaut. I show how he echoes Sayers and their lives overlapped, the great French New Wave filmmaker. So
sure.
her theory is being proven by even non-Christians who take creativity seriously.
Yeah. It's a fascinating realm. I mean, I'm glad. I so appreciate you being on the show today.
Oh,
This,
sure.
like, I think film is just one of those. I've loved movies for as long as I can remember, and I sort of have this intuitive sense of which ones I like and which ones I don't, and which ones are actually good and which ones aren't.
Yeah.
And I like a little of both, I suppose. But I think your book really did clarify for me how some of this stuff works, and it's
Oh,
going to give
good.
me some tools as I watch movies now to sort of go back and go, oh, I see what the filmmaker's doing here. That's a really interesting way that he's arranging those shots and those kind of things. So I guess I'd say encourage the audience, get the book, read through it, because I do think it gives you some handles. Most people aren't familiar with all the film terminology. I know I wasn't. And so it gives you some handles to go in when you're watching a film and go, oh, I get what's happening now with the scenes. I understand why this scene's here and what he's doing with the camera angle and how the music's working, with the film and all that kind of good stuff. That was really fascinating. And I so appreciated the historical approach that you took because I thought it was just great. So
Oh, thank you.
yeah. So, folks, if you're out there and you ever watch a movie, I would definitely recommend The Wages of Cinema. It was a fun read for me. I enjoyed
Okay.
it and really appreciate you being here to talk about it.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we'll leave it there and we will catch you on the next episode of Thinking Christian. Thanks so much, everybody. And look for the book in the show notes as well. This is an IVP title. So we get a 20% discount on the IVP title. So you can get a
Ooh, good.
20% discount and the code will be in the show notes and any other relevant links and all those different kind of things to Dr. Downing's work will be in the show notes as well. So take care, everybody. See you on the next episode.